I still remember the sound of champagne glasses clinking in my father's living room the day after his funeral. While I was upstairs in my childhood bedroom, still in my black dress, crying into tissues that smelled like the lavender sachets Mom used to keep in the linen closet, my stepmother Linda and her twin daughters were downstairs celebrating. Actually celebrating. I could hear Linda's shrill laugh echoing through the house as she called her sister on speakerphone, bragging about how she'd finally hit the jackpot and how my father had come through in the end. The twins, Jessica and Jennifer, were already arguing over who would get his vintage Mustang and who would take the lake house in Lake Tahoe. It was barely 24 hours since we'd lowered his casket into the ground, and they were dividing up his life like vultures picking at roadkill. The will reading had been a nightmare I'm still trying to wake up from. I sat in that sterile law office on 5th Street, surrounded by mahogany furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, listening to Mr. Henderson drone on in his monotone voice about assets and beneficiaries. Linda sat across from me in her perfectly tailored black suit, the same one she'd worn to seduce my father at my mother's book club 15 years ago, with that smug smile she'd perfected over the years. The twins flanked her like matching bookends, their fake sympathy from the day before completely gone, replaced by barely contained excitement. When Mr. Henderson announced that Linda would inherit the house, the business, and the majority of Dad's assets, with only a small trust fund left for me, I felt like someone had ripped my heart out through my throat. The woman who had made my teenage years a living hell, who had convinced my father that I was difficult and ungrateful, had walked away with everything that should have been my mother's legacy. But let me back up and tell you how we got to this point, because this story doesn't start with my father's death or even with Linda's entrance into our lives. It starts with a perfect family that was destroyed by one woman's greed and manipulation, and how I spent 15 years watching my father become someone I didn't recognize. My mother, Sarah, died when I was 16. Breast cancer, the kind that takes you fast and leaves everyone else wondering what the hell just happened. She was the heart of our family, the one who made Sunday pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse even when I was too old for it, who drove me to volleyball practice every Tuesday and Thursday without complaint, who stayed up all night helping me with my college applications because she believed in my dreams more than I did. Dad was lost without her, completely and utterly lost, like a ship without an anchor in a storm that never seemed to end. Linda swooped in 6 months after Mom died, showing up at our church with her perfectly highlighted hair and her twin daughters who were my age. She positioned herself as the grieving widow. Her husband had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, she claimed, and she had this way of making herself indispensable to everyone around her. She brought casseroles to our house when Dad was too depressed to cook. She volunteered to help with the church fundraiser Mom used to organize, and she always seemed to know exactly what to say to make people feel sorry for her. I watched her work her magic on my father, who was so desperate for companionship and so guilty about moving on from Mom that he couldn't see what was happening right in front of him. Within a year, she had moved herself and her daughters into our house, claiming it was just temporary until she got back on her feet, but I knew better. I could see the calculating look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. The transformation of my father from the man who used to take me fishing every Saturday morning to someone who questioned every decision I made was gradual but devastating. Linda had this insidious way of planting seeds of doubt about me in his mind, always framed as concern for my well-being. She'd mention how I seemed angry all the time, and how teenage girls needed a mother's guidance, especially girls who had lost their way after losing their real mother. She convinced him that my grief was abnormal, that my resistance to her moving in was a sign of deeper problems, and that I needed therapy to work through my issues. Meanwhile, her own daughters were presented as paragons of virtue. Jessica was the cheerleader with perfect grades. Jennifer was the star of the debate team with early admission to Northwestern. They played their parts perfectly, calling my father Dad within 6 months and making sure to be extra affectionate with him whenever I was around, as if to highlight what a disappointment I was in comparison. By the time Dad married Linda in a small ceremony at the courthouse, exactly 2 years after Mom's death, not that anyone was counting, I had become the outsider in my own family. The house that used to smell like Mom's vanilla candles and her famous chocolate chip cookies now reeked of Linda's overpowering perfume and the scented plugins she installed in every room. My mother's furniture was slowly replaced with Linda's more modern pieces, and Mom's photos were relegated to a small shelf in the hallway, while Linda's family pictures took prominence on the mantelpiece. I tried to protest, tried to make Dad see what was happening, but every conversation ended the same way, with him defending Linda and questioning why I couldn't just be happy for him and give her a chance. The man who used to read me bedtime stories and teach me how to change a tire had become a stranger who looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than his daughter who needed him more than ever. The next 8 years were like living in a psychological war zone where I was the only one who seemed to realize there was a battle going on. Linda had perfected the art of making my life miserable while maintaining her image as the perfect stepmother to anyone on the outside. She had this way of timing her cruelest comments for when Dad wasn't around, then switching to sweet concern the moment he walked into the room. When I complained about her behavior, she'd put on this wounded expression and tell Dad how hard she was trying to connect with me, how she understood that I was still grieving my mother, and how patient she was willing to be with my difficult phase. Dad would look at me with disappointment and ask why I couldn't see how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much about our family's well-being. The twins were just as manipulative as their mother, but they were more direct about their disdain for me. They treated our house like their personal kingdom and me like an unwelcome guest who had overstayed her welcome. Jessica would borrow my clothes without asking and return them stained or damaged, claiming it was an accident when confronted. Jennifer would deliberately eat food I had saved for lunch or use up all the hot water before school, then act innocent when I got upset. They had their friends over constantly, taking over the living room and kitchen like they owned the place, while I was expected to stay in my room and not disturb their activities. When I tried to study for my SATs in the dining room, Linda would announce that the twins needed to use the space for their more important college prep activities, since they were both naturally gifted students, unlike some people who had to struggle just to keep up. The financial manipulation started subtly but became more obvious as the years went on. Linda convinced Dad that I was too spoiled and needed to learn the value of money, so my allowance was cut while the twins got increases for their exceptional behavior. When it came time for college applications, suddenly there wasn't enough money in the budget for me to apply to my dream schools, but somehow the twins both got full support for their extensive application processes, including expensive SAT prep courses and private college counselors. I ended up at the local state university, living at home to save money, while Jessica went to her first-choice private college in California and Jennifer got her Northwestern acceptance. Dad justified this by saying I needed to prove myself academically before he'd invest in more expensive education, conveniently ignoring that my grades were just as good as theirs. The isolation was perhaps the worst part of it all. Linda systematically destroyed my relationships with extended family members by spreading subtle poison about my attitude and behavior. At family gatherings, she'd make comments about how challenging it was to raise a teenager who resented authority and how she worried about my anger issues. She'd share carefully edited stories about my supposed outbursts and difficulties, always framed with fake concern and martyred sighs about how hard she was trying to help me. My aunts and uncles, who had been close to my mother, gradually started treating me differently, like I was a problem child they needed to handle with kid gloves. Uncle Mike, who used to take me to baseball games every summer, started declining when I asked to spend time with him, saying he thought I needed to focus on working things out at home first. College became my escape, even though I was still living under Linda's roof. I threw myself into my studies with desperate intensity, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at the campus bookstore to pay for my own expenses. I majored in business administration with a minor in accounting, partly because I was good with numbers and partly because I wanted to understand exactly how money and assets worked. Something told me I'd need that knowledge someday. Linda loved to remind me that I was lucky to have a roof over my head and that most stepmothers wouldn't be so generous with ungrateful stepchildren. She made it clear that my presence in the house was conditional on my good behavior, which meant never contradicting her, never complaining about the twins, and certainly never questioning her decisions about household matters or Dad's money. The breaking point should have been when Linda convinced Dad to take out a second mortgage on the house my mother had helped him buy, the house where all my childhood memories lived, to fund a family business venture that somehow only included herself and the twins. She wanted to open a boutique clothing store in the trendy part of downtown, and she painted this picture of a thriving family enterprise that would secure everyone's future. Dad was hesitant at first, but Linda worked on him for months, pointing out how successful the twins were becoming and how this business could be their legacy. She made sure to mention frequently how I was clearly not interested in family enterprises since I was always buried in my books and never contributed to family discussions. When the boutique opened 6 months later, I wasn't even invited to the grand opening party, despite the fact that my mother's house was now mortgaged to pay for their dream. I drove by that night and saw them all through the window, laughing and celebrating, looking like the perfect family they'd always pretended to be when outsiders were watching. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday morning in October when I got the call that Dad had collapsed at work. I was in my advanced corporate finance class, taking notes about merger acquisitions, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional but urgent. Dad had suffered a massive heart attack at his accounting firm and was being rushed to St. Mary's Hospital. I grabbed my books and ran across campus to my beat-up Honda Civic, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When I burst through the hospital doors 20 minutes later, Linda and the twins were already there, huddled together in the waiting room like they'd been expecting this call. Linda looked up at me with those cold blue eyes and said, "Oh, you actually came. How thoughtful of you to finally show some concern for your father." The next 72 hours were a blur of machines beeping, doctors speaking in hushed tones, and Linda playing the role of the devastated wife to perfection. She held Dad's hand while he was unconscious, whispering about how much she loved him and how they had so many plans for the future. The twins took turns sitting by his bedside, telling stories about their college achievements and their bright futures, while I stood in the corner feeling like an intruder at my own father's deathbed. When Dad briefly regained consciousness on the second day, his eyes found mine across the room, and for just a moment, I saw the father I remembered from before Linda entered our lives. He mouthed, "I'm sorry" to me, but before I could respond, Linda was there, blocking my view, asking him if he needed anything and promising him that she'd take care of everything. Dad died on Sunday morning at 6:47 a.m., just as the sun was coming up over the hospital parking lot. I was holding his left hand while Linda gripped his right, and I felt the exact moment his life left his body. It was like watching a candle flame flicker and go out. Linda immediately collapsed into dramatic sobs, calling for the nurses and making sure everyone in the ICU knew how much she'd lost. The twins surrounded her with tissues and comforting words, creating this picture of a grieving family that somehow didn't include me. I stood there in stunned silence, feeling completely alone despite being surrounded by people, realizing that the one person who could have made things right between us was gone forever. The regret hit me like a physical blow. All those years I'd spent being angry at him for choosing Linda over me, and now I'd never get the chance to tell him that I understood he was just lonely and scared after Mom died. The funeral arrangements became Linda's grand performance, and I was relegated to the role of silent observer in my own father's final goodbye. She planned everything without consulting me, the flowers, the music, the eulogy speakers, claiming that I was too emotional to make important decisions and that she wanted to protect me from additional stress. When I suggested that we include some of Dad's favorite songs from the 70s, the music he used to play while working in his garage, Linda dismissed the idea, saying the service needed to be dignified and appropriate, not some nostalgic trip down memory lane. She chose speakers who barely knew my father but who could be counted on to praise her devotion as a wife, while Uncle Mike, who had known Dad since college, was told there wasn't enough time on the program for additional speakers. Standing at my father's graveside, watching them lower his casket while Linda dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, something inside me finally snapped. I realized that I had spent 8 years trying to win back a man who had been systematically turned against me, and now he was gone, taking with him any chance of redemption or reconciliation. But more than that, I realized that Linda had been planning for this moment all along. The way she immediately took charge of the funeral arrangements, how quickly she had contacted the lawyer, her complete lack of surprise at inheriting everything. It was like she'd been preparing for Dad's death for years. As dirt hit the mahogany casket with hollow thuds, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to disappear quietly into the background like Linda expected. I was going to fight for what was rightfully mine. Not just the money and property, but the truth about who my father really was before she poisoned his mind against me. The revelation came to me as I was cleaning out my father's home office 3 days after the funeral, while Linda and the twins were at the lawyer's office signing paperwork for the estate transfer. I was supposed to be packing up my personal belongings before moving out. Linda had made it clear that I had exactly 1 week to find somewhere else to live, since the house would be sold as soon as possible to liquidate assets for the business expansion. I was going through Dad's desk drawers, looking for any photos of him and Mom that I could salvage, when I found a business card tucked behind a picture of me at my high school graduation. The card was worn and creased, like it had been handled many times, and it belonged to a lawyer I'd never heard of, Marcus Webb, estate planning attorney, with an address downtown that wasn't Mr. Henderson's office. On the back of the card, in Dad's handwriting, was a note that made my blood run cold. In case of emergency, tell Emily the truth about her mother's will. My hands started shaking as I stared at those words, because they implied something I'd never considered, that there had been more to my mother's death than just her battle with cancer, and that Linda's inheritance of everything might not be as legitimate as everyone believed. I called Marcus Webb's office at 8 a.m. sharp the next morning, my voice barely steady as I explained who I was and that I'd found his card among my father's belongings. His secretary put me through immediately, and when Mr. Webb heard my name, there was a long pause before he said, "Emily, I've been waiting for your call for 15 years. Can you come in today? There are things about your mother's estate that you need to know." I drove to his office in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities and dreading what I might discover. Mr. Webb was nothing like the stuffy Mr. Henderson. He was younger, warmer, and when he looked at me, I saw something that had been missing from my life for years, someone who saw me as Sarah Mitchell's daughter, not as Linda's problem stepdaughter. What Mr. Webb told me in his oak-paneled office that morning changed everything I thought I knew about my family's history. My mother hadn't just left everything to my father in a simple will. She had created a complex trust structure specifically designed to protect me and ensure that I would inherit her assets when I turned 25 or immediately upon my father's death, whichever came first. The house, the life insurance money, her family's antique jewelry, and a substantial investment portfolio she'd built over the years. All of it was supposed to come to me, with my father serving only as trustee until the conditions were met. But Linda had somehow convinced my father to keep this information from me, claiming it would be better for my development if I believed I had to earn my inheritance through good behavior and academic achievement. The most devastating revelation was that my mother had suspected something like this might happen. In a sealed letter she'd left with Mr. Webb, to be opened only in the event of my father's remarriage, she had written her fears about leaving me vulnerable to manipulation by a potential stepmother. She knew my father's weaknesses, his need to be needed, his tendency to avoid conflict, his desperate desire to rebuild the family we'd lost when she died. Her letter contained specific instructions for Mr. Webb to monitor the situation and intervene if he believed I was being deliberately kept from my inheritance or if my father was being unduly influenced in matters concerning my mother's estate. The boutique that Linda had funded with a second mortgage? That was actually fraud, since the house was part of my mother's trust and couldn't be used as collateral for Linda's business ventures. But here's the part that made my blood boil. Linda had known about the trust all along. Mr. Webb showed me documents proving that Linda had contacted him multiple times over the years, trying to find loopholes in my mother's will and pushing for modifications that would give her more control over the assets. She had even hired her own lawyer to challenge the trust's validity, claiming that as my father's wife, she had rights to community property that superseded my mother's wishes. When those challenges failed, she had focused her efforts on turning my father against me, hoping that if I were estranged from the family, he might be willing to disinherit me entirely and leave everything to her and the twins. Mr. Webb had tried to contact my father several times over the years, but Linda had intercepted his calls and letters, telling Dad that there were legal complications that required patience and that it would be cruel to get Emily's hopes up until everything was sorted out. She had convinced him that the best thing for me was to learn self-reliance and not depend on unearned inheritance that might make me lazy or entitled. Meanwhile, she was systematically draining the trust's liquid assets through various legal maneuvers, paying herself management fees, and using creative accounting to justify expenses that had nothing to do with my well-being or education. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to crash Linda's victory party. I drove to my father's house, my mother's house, where Linda and the twins were hosting a celebration dinner with their closest friends, toasting their good fortune and making plans for their expanded business empire. I could hear the laughter and champagne glasses clinking from the street as I walked up the front steps with Mr. Webb beside me and a folder full of legal documents in my hands. When I rang the doorbell, Jennifer opened it with a glass of wine in her hand, her face immediately falling when she saw me. "What are you doing here, Emily? Mom said you were moving out today." "I am," I said, pushing past her into the living room where Linda was holding court with a dozen people I barely recognized. "But first, there's something everyone needs to hear." The room fell silent as Linda's face went white, her eyes immediately focusing on Mr. Webb and the official-looking papers in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice stronger than it had been in years, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Webb, my mother's estate attorney. He has some very interesting information about my inheritance that I think you'll all want to hear." What followed was the most satisfying 45 minutes of my entire life. Mr. Webb calmly and methodically explained the true nature of my mother's will while Linda's guests watched in stunned silence. He detailed how Linda had been illegally using trust assets, how the second mortgage was fraudulent, and how my mother had actually left me assets worth over $2 million. Money that had been growing in investments for 15 years, while Linda convinced everyone I was barely worth a small trust fund. He announced that effective immediately, all of my mother's assets were being transferred to me, including full ownership of the house, and that Linda had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises and repay the funds she had illegally accessed. The twins started crying, Linda started screaming about unfairness and legal challenges, and her friends began quietly slipping out the door, suddenly remembering other places they needed to be. Linda tried to claim that she had been a devoted wife and stepmother who deserved compensation for her years of sacrifice. But Mr. Webb simply handed her a cease and desist order and informed her that any further attempts to challenge my mother's will would result in criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Jessica and Jennifer begged me to reconsider, claiming they had always thought of me as their sister and that this would destroy their family, but I looked at them with the same cold indifference they had shown me for years. "You made your choice about what kind of family we were going to be," I told them. "Now you get to live with the consequences." As I sat in my childhood bedroom that night, surrounded by boxes of my mother's belongings that Linda had hidden away in the attic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years: peace. The house was quiet for the first time since Linda had moved in, and I could finally hear my own thoughts without her constant criticism and manipulation. I found my mother's jewelry box, her photo albums, and letters she had written to me that were meant to be given to me on my 18th birthday, letters that Linda had intercepted and hidden. Reading my mother's words, her hopes for my future, and her absolute confidence in my strength, I realized that she had known all along that I would eventually find my way back to the truth. 6 months later, I'm living in the house where I grew up, running my own financial consulting business from my father's old office, and sleeping peacefully in a space that finally feels like home again. Linda and the twins moved to a small apartment across town, and their boutique closed within 3 months when they couldn't make the loan payments without access to my trust fund. I occasionally see them around town, and they always look away quickly, unable to meet my eyes. The extended family members who had bought into Linda's narrative about my difficult behavior have slowly started reaching out, apologizing for believing her lies and asking if we can rebuild our relationships. Some bridges can be repaired, others are permanently burned, but that's okay. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who truly see you and support you when everything falls apart. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in it, if you're the scapegoat in a family that has gaslit you into believing you're the problem, I want you to know that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Document everything, trust your instincts, and don't let anyone convince you that you're crazy for seeing manipulation where others see kindness. Sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones who are working hardest to destroy us, and sometimes the only way to save yourself is to stop trying to save the relationship. My mother's love protected me even after her death, and her wisdom gave me the strength to fight for what was rightfully mine. Find your own strength, seek your own truth, and never let anyone make you smaller than you are meant to be.